Listen, West. 1 minute ago, I signed the treaty that destroys you forever. The anti-West superpower with Iran is born. 54 African nations armed and ready for total confrontation. Your sanctions are worthless. Your threats are jokes. We're cutting off every resource you need. Your 5 centuries of rape and theft end now. Let me tell you what actually happened. On January 9, 2026, at precisely 11:34 a.m. West Africa time, I signed the Treaty for Global Multipolarity and Anti-Hegemonic Cooperation with the Islamic Republic of Iran in a secure government compound outside Abuja that your satellites photographed but your analysts dismissed as routine diplomatic facility. The treaty establishes formal superpower alliance between 54 African nations and Iran, creating integrated bloc with combined population of 1.6 billion people, combined GDP of $4.2 trillion, control over 38% of global strategic resources, unified military command structure coordinating 800,000 active troops, and shared commitment to dismantling Western dominance across every domain of global power. This isn't defensive pact. This isn't symbolic partnership. This is offensive alliance designed specifically to destroy Western control over international institutions, over global commerce, over military interventions, and over political narratives that justified centuries of exploitation disguised as civilization, development, and humanitarian concern. The treaty that I negotiated over 19 months without your intelligence detecting substantive discussions creates comprehensive integration across military, economic, technological, intelligence, and diplomatic domains that transforms isolated resistance into coordinated superpower challenging your position. Your analysts reading treaty language that I'm publishing today will immediately recognize that this alliance possesses every characteristic defining superpowers, including global reach through military deployments, economic leverage through resource control, technological capabilities through indigenous development and partnerships, intelligence networks through coordinated collection, and ideological appeal through anti-hegemonic narrative resonating with billions who suffered under Western dominance. The difference between historical superpowers and the bloc I created is that previous superpowers sought to replace Western dominance with their own, while my alliance seeks to eliminate dominance entirely by creating multipolar order where no single power or bloc controls global affairs. Your immediate reaction will be dismissing this alliance as aspirational rather than operational, as symbolic rather than substantive, and as temporary rather than enduring because you cannot imagine that African nations and Iran possess capability, resources, and determination necessary for superpower status that you assumed required centuries of development, required specific cultural characteristics, and required technological foundations that you believed only Western civilization could produce. Every assumption reflects the same arrogance that caused your intelligence failures, the same racial and cultural biases that prevented you from recognizing African sophistication, and the same historical blindness that made you forget that non-Western civilizations produced superpowers long before Europe emerged from medieval darkness. Chinese dynasties controlled vast territories when Europeans lived in primitive kingdoms. Islamic caliphates preserved knowledge that European Dark Ages lost. African empires traded across continents when European nations barely controlled regions beyond their capitals. I'm not creating something unprecedented. I'm restoring the natural multipolar order that existed before European colonization disrupted global balance, before Western military technology enabled temporary dominance, and before colonial exploitation generated wealth that you pretend resulted from cultural superiority rather than systematic theft. The 5 centuries of Western dominance were historical aberration made possible by specific technological advantages in naval power and weapons that enabled colonial conquest, by exploitation of colonized resources that financed industrial development, and by creation of international institutions after World War II that embedded Western advantages into global architecture that you claimed was universal but actually served Western interests exclusively. That aberration is ending not because Western powers suddenly collapsed, but because the rest of the world finally organized sufficient coordination, developed sufficient capabilities, and achieved sufficient confidence to challenge dominance that we outnumber, that we can outproduce, and that we will outlast, because our determination exceeds your commitment to maintaining privileges that you know are unjust. The treaty establishes Supreme Council for Multipolarity as governing body, where my representatives and Iranian leadership coordinate strategic decisions through consensus rather than through hierarchy that would replicate dominant structures we're dismantling. The Council meets quarterly in rotating locations across member nations, ensuring that no single capital becomes center of power, that all members participate equally regardless of economic or military strength, and that decisions reflect collective wisdom rather than individual leader preferences. The consensus requirement means decisions take longer, but ensures buy-in from all members, making implementation more reliable than hierarchical systems where subordinate members comply reluctantly with decisions imposed by dominant powers. You structured your alliances through American dominance, where where Washington decided and allies implemented. I structured this alliance through genuine equality where we decide together and implement collectively. The Council's first decision implemented immediately is establishing Joint Resource Management Authority controlling exports of strategic materials that Western industries depend on, including cobalt, platinum, manganese, chromium, rare earth elements, uranium, oil, and natural gas that members produce. The authority doesn't eliminate exports but redirects them from Western destinations toward partners supporting multipolar order, including China, Russia, India, and developing nations who trade fairly rather than exploiting colonial-era contracts that paid us pennies while you generated billions. Authority decisions require approval from resource-producing members, ensuring that export policies reflect their interests rather than impose collective decisions that harm individual members. The flexibility prevents internal conflicts while maintaining coordination that makes the alliance effective rather than symbolic. Western access to member resources becomes conditional on policy changes that treaty specifies, including termination of sanctions against member nations, withdrawal of military forces from member territories, cessation of interference in member domestic affairs, renegotiation of colonial-era contracts under fair terms, and reparations for historical exploitation that development economists estimate cost Africa alone $14 trillion in extracted wealth over 5 centuries. You'll claim these demands are unreasonable, are impossible to satisfy, and demonstrate that alliance is aggressive rather than defensive. But examine each demand honestly and recognize that reasonable means restoring justice that colonialism violated, that possible means accepting costs that you imposed on us for centuries, and that defensive means protecting against ongoing exploitation that your current policies perpetuate despite formal decolonization that change flags without changing economic structures. Your sanctions against Iran that you've maintained for 47 years constitute economic warfare attempting to starve populations into overthrowing government that you dislike. Terminating sanctions is minimum requirement for civilized international relations rather than extraordinary concession that costs you anything except leverage that economic coercion provided. Your military forces in African territories operate from 127 bases that you established through pressure on weak post-colonial governments who signed basing agreements because refusing meant aid cutoffs and potential covert operations. Withdrawing forces is restoring sovereignty that your presence violated rather than strategic concession that weakens your security. Your interference in member domestic affairs through covert operations, through support to opposition groups, and through diplomatic pressure attempting regime change constitutes ongoing aggression that international law prohibits. Ceasing interference is complying with international law rather than accepting constraints on freedom of action that you never legitimately possessed. Colonial-era contracts that you signed with colonial governments or with post-independence leaders who you installed through coups remain in effect decades after decolonization, charging us minimal royalties for resources that generate massive profits for your corporations. Renegotiating contracts under fair terms means paying market rates rather than colonial rates that theft established. Reparations for historical exploitation that killed tens of millions through slavery, that stole resources worth trillions, and that destroyed social structures requiring centuries to rebuild is acknowledging debt that you owe rather than demanding payment that you're entitled to refuse. Every demand that treaty makes is restoring justice rather than imposing injustice, is correcting historical crimes rather than committing new ones, and is requiring you to act morally rather than asking us to accept continued exploitation. You'll refuse every demand claiming that historical grievances don't justify current claims, that colonial crimes were committed by previous generations who current populations shouldn't pay for, and that international relations require accepting status quo rather than attempting to reverse historical injustices. Your position is morally bankrupt because stolen wealth that you inherited doesn't become legitimate through time passage, because current populations who benefit from historical crimes share responsibility for redress, and because status quo that injustice created doesn't deserve preservation just because victims eventually stopped violent resistance. If burglar steals your property and passes it to his children, do his children get to keep stolen property because they weren't the ones who stole it? Legal systems worldwide answer no, because stolen property remains stolen regardless of how many hands it passes through. But you claim different standard applies internationally because you control international institutions and because victims who demand justice lack power to compel payment. That power imbalance just changed because alliance I created possesses leverage to compel what justice requires. Resource control that authority implements gives us economic weapon that sanctions gave you for decades. Your industries cannot function without our cobalt, platinum, and rare earths. Your economies collapse without our oil and uranium. Your militaries degrade without materials that our territories contain. We're implementing export restrictions until you meet treaty demands, not because we're aggressive, but because economic leverage is only tool that you understand, only pressure that you respond to, and only method that achieves justice when you refuse voluntary compliance. You used economic leverage against us for decades, claiming that sanctions served humanitarian purposes, protected international order, and promoted democracy. We're using economic leverage against you to achieve actual justice rather than to impose regime change, to compel behavior change rather than to starve populations, and to restore equity rather than to maintain dominance. The treaty establishes Unified Defense Command, integrating military forces from 55 nations under joint leadership that Iranian and African generals share. The command controls 800,000 active troops, operates 2,000 combat aircraft, commands 400 naval vessels, and possesses integrated air defense networks covering territories from Atlantic Ocean to Persian Gulf. Your Pentagon analysts reading these numbers will compare them to American military strength, noting that you possess more troops, more advanced aircraft, more powerful navy, and more sophisticated technology, concluding that alliance military capabilities pose no serious threat to American military dominance. Your analysis is correct regarding technology, but completely wrong regarding strategic impact, because military strength isn't measured only by technology and numbers, but by will to fight, by sustainability of operations, by strategic position, and by political context that makes military superiority irrelevant when using it triggers costs that exceed benefits. Our troops lack your training and equipment, but possess will to fight that your professional military struggles to match, because your soldiers fight for paychecks while ours fight for sovereignty, fight to end centuries of humiliation, and fight for future where their children live free from Western domination. Your equipment is more advanced, but our equipment is adequate for defensive operations, for asymmetric warfare, and for imposing costs on your interventions that make victory meaningless even when you achieve battlefield success. Your navy dominates oceans, but our geography provides strategic depth that navies cannot control. Our resources provide leverage that navies cannot seize, and our populations provide resilience that naval blockades cannot break. Your technology provides tactical advantages, but our political context means using military force against us triggers economic retaliation through resource cutoffs, triggers international opposition from developing world, and triggers domestic political crises when voters question why their government is fighting wars that cost jobs and raise prices for objectives that don't matter to their daily lives. The command's strategic doctrine prioritizes defensive operations protecting member territories, retaliatory operations imposing costs on aggressors, and denial operations preventing you from achieving objectives even when you achieve tactical victories. We're not planning to invade your territories because we don't need to, when defensive posture that imposes costs on aggression achieves our objectives without offensive operations that would justify your propaganda about threats requiring military response. You invade others because expansion serves your interests. We defend ourselves because resistance serves our interests. The difference matters because international law permits defensive operations and condemns aggressive wars, making our position legally and morally superior regardless of military balance. Your historical pattern is framing defensive resistance as aggression requiring your intervention. That framing fails when we clearly state defensive intentions, when we coordinate with majority of international community, and when your aggression is obvious to audiences worldwide who observe your military operations in our territories while we conduct no operations in yours. The command's retaliatory doctrine specifies that attacks on any member territory trigger coordinated military response from all members, ensuring that attacking one means fighting 55 nations simultaneously. Your military can defeat any single member but cannot fight 55 simultaneously across territories spanning 3 continents covering 11 million square miles while defending against Chinese operations in Asia, Russian operations in Europe, and domestic unrest that prolonged wars trigger when casualties accumulate and economic costs mount. Your war games modeling conflict with alliance conclude that victory is possible through overwhelming force application, but costs exceed any conceivable benefit, making war politically impossible even when militarily feasible. That gap between military capability and political willingness is strategic vulnerability that defensive alliances exploit by making aggression too costly politically even when possible militarily. The command's denial doctrine aims to prevent you from achieving occupation, regime change, or resource seizure even when you defeat our militaries in conventional battles. Vietnamese resistance proved that losing every battle doesn't prevent winning wars when political will outlasts military capacity, when population support sustains resistance indefinitely, and when occupiers eventually withdraw after determining that costs exceed benefits. Afghan resistance proved the same lesson against Soviets and against Americans using different tactics, but same strategic logic that indigenous populations defending their territory possess advantages that overwhelm conventional military superiority when conflicts extend beyond initial invasion. Iraqi resistance proved that defeating armies doesn't enable controlling populations when occupied populations reject occupation, when religious and ethnic divisions complicate governance, and when neighboring nations support resistance through sanctuaries and supply routes that occupiers cannot seal without expanding wars that domestic politics prohibit. We studied every resistance campaign against Western powers, identifying patterns that successful resistance follows, identifying mistakes that failed resistance made, and identifying innovations that contemporary technology enables beyond what historical resistance achieved. Successful resistance requires political legitimacy that populations grant to governments defending sovereignty rather than to foreign occupiers claiming humanitarian justifications, requires external sanctuaries where resistance forces can rest, regroup, and resupply beyond reach of occupation forces, requires supply routes that neighboring nations provide through porous borders that occupiers cannot seal, requires popular support that provides intelligence, concealment, and recruits that resistance requires for sustained operations, requires time that exhausts occupier will before exhausting resistance capability, requires strategic patience that accepts temporary defeats while maintaining long-term commitment that occupiers cannot match when domestic politics demand withdrawal after casualties and costs accumulate. Failed resistance alienates populations through targeting civilians, through religious extremism that majority reject, through incompetent governance in controlled areas, through dependence on external patrons whose interests don't match indigenous interests, and through factionalization that creates internal conflicts distracting from resistance against occupiers. We avoid every mistake that failed resistance made by maintaining political legitimacy through effective governance, by avoiding extremism that alienates populations, by coordinating among diverse nations through consensus that prevents factionalization, and by balancing external support with indigenous capability, ensuring that we control our resistance rather than becoming proxies for external powers. Contemporary technology enables innovations that historical resistance couldn't achieve, including encrypted communications that occupiers cannot intercept, precision weapons that minimize civilian casualties while maximizing military effects, cyber capabilities that disrupt occupation logistics and intelligence, drone swarms that overwhelm sophisticated air defenses through numbers rather than technology, and social media that broadcasts resistance activities to global audiences bypassing occupier information control. We're implementing every innovation that technology enables, that our partners provide through training and equipment, and that our strategic doctrine requires for effective resistance. Your assumption that conventional military superiority enables you to occupy our territories repeats mistakes that Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq should have taught. We're prepared for occupations that your strategic culture makes inevitable when you face resistance because you cannot imagine that non-Western peoples could possess determination exceeding your capability to impose control. The treaty establishes economic integration framework coordinating trade, investment, development, and monetary policies across member nations, creating economic bloc that rivals Western economies in population, that exceeds Western control of strategic resources, and that provides alternative to Western-dominated financial architecture through institutions that we control. Framework establishes African Iranian Development Bank capitalized with $80 billion from member contributions, from Chinese investment, and from Russian participation, providing development financing without political conditions that IMF and World Bank impose. Establishes Continental Iranian Trade Zone, eliminating tariffs among members, harmonizing regulations, facilitating commerce, and prioritizing internal trade over Western trade that historically extracted resources while preventing industrialization. Establishes Resource Coordination Authority that I mentioned earlier, managing strategic exports, ensuring that our resources serve our development rather than Western consumption. Establishes Common Investment Fund, pooling sovereign wealth from oil revenues, from resource royalties, and from foreign reserves, creating capital for infrastructure projects that individual nations cannot finance alone. The bank provides development financing at 3% interest without structural adjustment conditions that destroyed African economies during 1980s and 1990s debt crises. IMF and World Bank loans came with conditions requiring privatization of state enterprises, requiring cuts to public spending on health and education, requiring market liberalization, opening economies to foreign competition that destroyed indigenous industries, and requiring export-oriented development that integrated economies into global system benefiting Western consumers while preventing diversification. Those conditions were called Washington Consensus, pretending that development policies reflected universal economic wisdom rather than serving donor interests. Reality is that Washington consensus enriched Western corporations who purchased privatized assets at bargain prices, who captured export markets that liberalization opened, and who extracted resources that development financing enabled while leaving debtor nations poorer, more dependent, and less developed than before loans they received. Our bank rejects Washington consensus because that model failed Africa, failed Latin America, and failed everywhere except in imaginations of economists who valued ideology over outcomes. Our loans finance infrastructure enabling industrialization rather than exports of raw materials, finance education producing skilled workers rather than cutting school budgets to repay debts, finance healthcare improving population health rather than privatizing hospitals for Western companies, finance agricultural development for food security rather than cash crops for export. Every loan serves our development rather than Western extraction because we control the bank, we set the conditions, and we prioritize our prosperity over your profit. You'll claim that development financing without structural conditions enables corruption, enables inefficiency, and prevents reforms that good governance requires. Translation: you're angry that we control our development rather than accepting your guidance that served your interests while preventing ours. The trade zone redirects commerce from colonial patterns where we exported raw materials to you and imported manufactured goods from you toward internal trade where we trade among ourselves and with partners who exchange goods rather than extract resources. Zone members produce oil, minerals, agricultural products, and increasingly manufactured goods that internal market of 1.6 billion consumers absorbs. Iranian manufacturing capabilities that sanctions force them to develop provide machinery, chemicals, and technology that African manufacturing requires. African resources provide raw materials that Iranian industries consume. The internal trade that colonial powers prevented through preferential tariffs favoring metropolitan exports now develops because we eliminated tariffs among ourselves while maintaining tariffs on Western imports that compete with indigenous industries we're building. You'll claim that protectionism prevents efficiency, prevents competition, and reduces consumer welfare. Translation: you're angry that we're industrializing rather than remaining raw material exporters and manufactured goods importers that colonial trade patterns required. The Resource Authority implements coordinated export restrictions that I mentioned earlier, ensuring that we control who buys our resources, what prices they pay, and what quantities they receive based on political relationship rather than on market mechanisms that you claim are neutral but actually favor wealthy buyers over producers. Authority members voted to restrict Western access by 60%, redirecting exports to China, Russia, India, and developing nations who support multipolarity rather than attempting to maintain Western dominance. Restrictions create supply shortages that raise prices, create industrial disruptions that cost jobs, and create political crises that force policy changes accepting our demands for justice. You'll claim that export restrictions violate free trade principles, violate contract obligations, and constitute economic warfare that justifies retaliation. Translation: you're angry that we're using economic leverage that you wielded against us for decades, and you're discovering that victims of economic warfare can become practitioners when they organize sufficient coordination. The investment fund directs $200 billion in sovereign wealth toward infrastructure projects that colonial extraction never financed, toward industrial development that imperialism prevented, and toward technological capabilities that dependency relationships denied. Fund finances high-speed rail connecting African cities, finances ports handling increased trade volumes, finances power plants generating electricity for industrialization, finances telecommunications infrastructure enabling digital economy, and finances research facilities developing technologies rather than importing them. Chinese engineering companies construct infrastructure that fund finances using experience from Belt and Road projects. Russian technical advisors provide expertise in nuclear power, aerospace, and defense industries. Iranian scientists share knowledge in chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing that sanctions force them to develop indigenously. Every project employs our workers, trains our engineers, and builds our capabilities rather than enriching Western contractors who previously captured development spending. The treaty establishes intelligence cooperation network integrating collection, analysis, and operations across member services, creating continental-scale intelligence capability that rivals Western systems in coverage, exceeds Western understanding of our territories, and provides counterintelligence capability defeating Western operations that previously penetrated our governments with impunity. Network establishes regional intelligence centers in 5 locations, coordinating collection against Western activities, analyzing threats from Western interference, and conducting operations neutralizing Western intelligence operations. Centers employ 12,000 intelligence professionals, including analysts, collectors, technical specialists, and operational officers that Russian and Iranian services trained specifically for confronting Western intelligence activities. The network's primary mission is detecting and defeating Western intelligence operations through aggressive counterintelligence that identifies Western officers, arrests recruited agents, exposes operational methods, and retaliates against personnel whose activities threaten member security. Russian advisors taught our services techniques that Soviet counterintelligence pioneered, including surveillance detection, agent identification through pattern analysis, technical surveillance using equipment that Western officers don't expect in African operations, and operational deception feeding false information that distorts Western understanding of our intentions and capabilities. Iranian advisors shared lessons from defeating Israeli and American operations, including importance of compartmentalization, preventing single arrests from compromising entire networks, importance of vetting, preventing recruitment of personnel with foreign connections, and importance of security culture where reporting foreign contacts is routine rather than exceptional. Network operations over past 18 months quietly identified and arrested 400 Western intelligence agents across member nations, identified and documented activities of 300 Western intelligence officers operating under diplomatic or commercial cover, and exposed 20 operational methods that Western services considered secure, but that we proved are vulnerable to sophisticated counterintelligence. We didn't publicize these operations because publicity would have warned officers and agents that we hadn't yet identified, allowing them to adjust security or withdraw before we arrested them. Now that alliance is public, I'm exposing what we've accomplished, demonstrating that Western intelligence dominance ended when we organized sufficient counterintelligence capability coordinated across territories that Western services assumed were penetrated beyond salvation. CIA station chiefs in 15 African capitals will be declared persona non grata and expelled within 72 hours. MI6 officers in 8 capitals face similar expulsion. French DGSE officers in 12 capitals get expelled. Every identified Western intelligence officer faces choice between immediate departure or arrest and prosecution for espionage that our laws define as capital offense. Recruited agents who we identified through surveillance, through communications intercepts, through financial analysis showing unexplained wealth, and through confessions from arrested agents will be arrested publicly, prosecuted in televised trials, and used for propaganda demonstrating Western interference while deterring others from considering recruitment. Operational methods that we exposed will be published in intelligence journals, will be taught in counterintelligence training, and will be shared with partner nations, enabling them to detect similar operations in their territories using techniques that our experience validated. The intelligence catastrophe that I'm inflicting on Western services exceeds anything hostile intelligence achieved during Cold War because scale of coordination across 55 nations, because sophistication of counterintelligence that Russian and Iranian training provided, and because political commitment to exposing operations rather than quietly managing them to protect diplomatic relationships. You assumed that African services lacked capability for sophisticated counterintelligence, lacked coordination for systematic operations, and lacked political support for actions that damage relations with Western capitals. Every assumption was wrong because we built capability through training that best adversaries of Western intelligence provided, because we coordinated through network that treaty established specifically for defeating Western operations, and because we possess political support from populations celebrating exposure of foreign spies as triumph for sovereignty rather than damage to foreign relations that colonial mentality would regret. The treaty establishes Diplomatic Coordination Commission managing our positions in international institutions, coordinating our votes on contested issues, and organizing our initiatives challenging Western dominance in institutions that you designed for perpetuating your control. Commission establishes unified voting bloc of 55 nations in UN General Assembly, where 193 members means we need 42 additional votes for simple majority and 84 additional votes for two-thirds majority. China and Russia provide 2 votes. Pakistan, Turkey, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Syria, Belarus, and North Korea provide 9 more. 140 nations participating in Belt and Road Initiative provide pool from which we build majorities through bilateral diplomacy, through economic incentives, and through appeals to shared interests in constraining Western dominance. Commission's first priority is reforming Security Council. That permanent member veto enables you to block initiatives threatening Western interests despite overwhelming global support. Reform proposals include expanding permanent membership to include India, Brazil, Nigeria, and Egypt, providing developing world with permanent representation that colonial-era structure denied. Include eliminating or restricting veto power that 5 permanent members exploit to protect interests and shield allies regardless of international law violations. Include weighted voting where large populations count more than small populations rather than current system where Luxembourg equals China in General Assembly despite population difference exceeding 2,000-fold. Every reform proposal serves interests of Global South majority whose voices current structure minimizes while amplifying Western minority whose interests current structure protects. You'll block reforms through veto power that reforms would eliminate, creating logical impossibility where system cannot reform because those who benefit from current system possess power to prevent reforms threatening their privileges. Your obstruction proves our argument that international institutions serve Western interests rather than global interests, that reform requires circumventing rather than working within institutions you control, and that alternative institutions are necessary when existing institutions cannot adapt to change power realities. We're building alternative institutions, including Development Bank that replaces IMF and World Bank, Trade Zone that replaces WTO rules with our own, and regional organizations that replace UN functions without Western veto powers. Your institutions become increasingly irrelevant as ours gain membership, as ours provide services, and as ours distribute benefits that yours deny to nations who challenge your preferences. Commission's second priority is contesting every Western initiative in international institutions, raising costs of American unilateralism, forcing compromise on initiatives you previously passed through minimal effort, and demonstrating that institutional dominance ended when sufficient nations organized permanent opposition. You'll propose sanctions against member nations for various violations. We'll oppose sanctions through procedural obstruction, through alternative resolutions condemning Western violations, and through mobilizing developing world majorities who refuse sanctions that appear as tools for Western coercion rather than enforcement of universal standards. You'll propose human rights resolutions condemning member practices. We'll counter with resolutions condemning Western practices, including mass incarceration, police brutality, indigenous peoples' treatment, and immigration policies separating families. You'll propose climate initiatives demanding emissions cuts from developing nations. We'll counter demanding climate reparations for historical emissions that caused crisis, demanding technology transfers enabling our development without emissions, and demanding that you cut emissions first as largest historical contributors. Every contest demonstrates that your institutional dominance ended, that outcomes now require negotiation rather than imposition, and that your preferences no longer automatically prevail when opposed by coordinated coalition. You'll claim that obstruction prevents solving global problems, prevents addressing threats, and proves that we're obstructionists rather than constructive participants. Translation: you're angry that we contest your dominance, and you're discovering that institutions work differently when participants are equals rather than when dominant power imposes preferences on subordinate members. We're not obstructionists. We're equals demanding recognition and requiring compromise that equality necessitates. The treaty establishes technological development consortium pooling research capabilities, sharing technological advances, and coordinating industrial development, enabling members to achieve technological sovereignty that dependency on Western technology prevented. Consortium establishes research centers in 6 locations focusing on strategic technologies including semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, aerospace, and advanced materials. Chinese technology firms provide advanced equipment, technical specifications, and engineering expertise that decades of development accumulated. Russian research institutes provide expertise in physics, mathematics, and engineering that Soviet education system produced and that Russian Federation maintained. Iranian scientists provide knowledge in chemistry, materials science, and nuclear technology that sanctions forced them to develop independently. African researchers contribute knowledge of local conditions, contribute creativity that fresh perspectives provide, and constitute workforce that consortium employs and trains. The consortium's semiconductor initiative aims to achieve production capability at 7-nanometer process nodes within 5 years, enabling manufacture of chips for civilian and military applications without dependence on Western or Taiwanese production that you could restrict through export controls. Chinese firms SMIC and Huawei provide manufacturing equipment, provide process knowledge, and provide training that Chinese semiconductor industry developed despite American restrictions attempting to prevent Chinese advancement. Russian expertise in materials science provides innovations that overcome Western patent protections through alternative approaches, achieving similar results. African mineral resources provide rare earths, specialty metals, and chemical precursors that semiconductor manufacturing requires without depending on imports that you could restrict. Your reaction will be claiming that 7-nanometer technology is obsolete because cutting-edge production reached 3 nanometers and will reach 1 nanometer within 5 years. True but irrelevant because 7-nanometer capability is adequate for most applications, eliminates dependency that export controls exploited, and provides foundation for further advancement that indigenous capability enables. You didn't achieve 3-nanometer capability overnight. You progressed through decades of incremental advancement building capabilities sequentially. We're compressing that timeline through technology transfer from partners, through focused investment that consortium provides, and through workforce training that our populations enable. Within a decade, we'll match your capabilities. Within 2 decades, we might exceed them because younger populations, because hunger for advancement, and because you've grown complacent from decades of dominance. The consortium's artificial intelligence initiative develops algorithms, training datasets, and applications serving our needs rather than importing Western systems that embed biases, that collect data for Western companies, and that solve problems relevant to Western users while ignoring problems we face. African facial recognition systems trained on Western datasets fail to accurately identify African faces because training data predominantly included European faces. Western agricultural AI optimizes crops growing in temperate climates while ignoring tropical crops that Africa grows. Western medical AI trained on Western patient data misdiagnoses conditions that present differently in African populations. Every application designed in West serves Western needs while providing inferior service to us. Our AI trained on our data, designed for our conditions, and solving our problems provides superior service that imports never delivered. The consortium's quantum computing initiative pursues quantum communications for encrypted networks that your NSA cannot intercept and quantum sensing for detecting stealth aircraft that your military superiority depends on. Chinese advances in quantum communications already demonstrated satellite-based systems that encryption prevents interception. Russian theoretical physicists contribute mathematical foundations that quantum applications require. Iranian physicists contribute experimental techniques that sanctions force them to develop using improvised equipment. Combined expertise accelerates our development beyond what individual members could achieve, enabling us to leapfrog intermediate stages that your development progressed through. Within 5 years, our communications will be quantum encrypted. Within 10 years, our sensors will detect stealth aircraft, eliminating advantages that fifth-generation fighters provide. Your technological edge is temporary because our coordination accelerates our development while your complacency slows your innovation. The treaty establishes media coordination network, creating alternative information ecosystem that challenges Western narrative dominance, that provides platforms for anti-hegemonic perspectives, and that reaches billions in developing world who increasingly question Western claims about universal values that look suspiciously like justifications for Western interests. Network establishes news services in Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Swahili, and Mandarin, providing coverage from our perspectives rather than Western viewpoints. Establishes social media platforms that don't censor content challenging Western narratives like Western platforms do. Establishes film and television production creating entertainment that reflects our cultures rather than Western values. Establishes educational content teaching our histories rather than Western-centered narratives that minimize or ignore non-Western civilizations. The network's news coverage emphasizes Western decline, multipolar rise, and legitimacy of resistance against hegemony. Coverage shows Western economic problems including inflation, inequality, and infrastructure decay that Western media minimizes. Shows Western political dysfunction including polarization, gridlock, and corruption that Western media normalizes. Shows Western military failures including Afghanistan withdrawal, Iraqi instability, and Libyan collapse that Western media memory holes. Shows multipolarity success including Chinese development, Russian resistance, and African advancement that Western media ignores or dismisses. Every story reinforces narrative that Western dominance is ending, that alternatives exist and succeed, and that aligning with declining hegemon is foolish when aligning with rising powers provides opportunities. The coverage doesn't require lying because Western problems are real, because multipolar successes are documented, and because perspective shift from Western viewpoint to our viewpoint creates dramatically different picture of global trends. The network's social media platforms provide alternatives to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube that censor content that Western governments claim is misinformation, but that often is simply perspectives challenging Western narratives. Our platforms permit content that Western platforms ban, including criticism of Western policies, including questioning Western historical narratives, including promoting alternative development models, and including organizing resistance against Western influence. We don't permit illegal content, including terrorism incitement, child exploitation, or violence organizing. But we define those categories narrowly rather than broadly like Western platforms do, enabling them to censor political content under safety pretexts. Our platforms grow because users migrate from Western platforms that censor their speech, because our platforms don't collect data for Western intelligence services, and because our platforms provide spaces for authentic non-Western discourse rather than Western-dominated conversations where our perspectives are marginal. The network's entertainment production creates films, television shows, music, and games that reflect our cultures, that celebrate our values, and that inspire our youth. Western entertainment dominates globally, spreading Western values, normalizing Western behaviors, and making Western lifestyles appear aspirational. Our youth grow up consuming Western entertainment, idolizing Western celebrities, and internalizing Western values that conflict with indigenous cultures, creating identity crises and cultural erosion. Our productions counter Western cultural imperialism through stories celebrating our histories, through characters reflecting our diversity, through values emphasizing community over individualism, and through aesthetics drawing from our artistic traditions. Nigerian Nollywood demonstrates that indigenous entertainment succeeds when given resources, when distributed effectively, and when quality matches audience expectations. We're replicating that success across 55 nations, creating cultural ecosystem that competes with Western entertainment in our markets and increasingly in global markets where billions of non-Western viewers exist. The treaty establishes Leadership Academy training next generation of political leaders, military commanders, intelligence officers, diplomats, and technical experts who will sustain alliance beyond current leadership that negotiated and signed treaty. Academy admits 5,000 students annually from member nations for intensive 2-year program teaching multipolar theory, teaching anti-hegemonic strategy, teaching technical skills that governance requires, and teaching leadership qualities that effective administration demands. Chinese professors teach development economics, emphasizing state-led industrialization rather than market fundamentalism. Russian instructors teach geopolitics, emphasizing balance of power rather than hegemonic stability theory. Iranian scholars teach resistance strategies, emphasizing ideological commitment rather than material incentives. African intellectuals teach liberation history, emphasizing agency rather than victimhood narratives. The Academy's purpose is creating cadre who share common worldview, who maintain personal networks across borders, who coordinate naturally through shared education, and who perpetuate alliance through institutional positions they achieve after graduation. Graduates will return to home countries, entering government service, military commands, intelligence positions, diplomatic corps, and academic positions where they influence policy, where they maintain coordination, and where they train future generations, perpetuating alliance indefinitely. The model copies successful precedent from colonial education, where Western universities educated colonial elites who internalized Western values, who maintained Western connections after independence, and who facilitated Western influence through psychological colonization that formal independence didn't eliminate. We're reversing that dynamic through education, producing elites who share anti-hegemonic worldview, who maintain alliance connections, and who resist Western influence through ideological commitment that education instilled. Your horror at this treaty reflects recognition that your era ended, that your dominance was temporary, and that the world is organizing alternative that your power cannot prevent. You'll attempt to dismiss alliance as doomed to fail through internal contradictions, through lack of resources, through ideological incoherence, or through your pressure that supposedly will divide us. Those arguments are wishful thinking rather than analysis, because you desperately want us to fail rather than objectively assessing our chances. We possess resources exceeding yours in strategic materials. We possess populations exceeding yours by factors of 8 to 10. We possess ideology that resonates with billions who suffered under your dominance. We possess determination that centuries of exploitation forged. We possess everything except your current technological edge that our coordination is eliminating through partnerships and indigenous development. You possess those same advantages historically, which is why you dominated. But advantages erode when circumstances change, when competitors emerge, and when arrogance prevents adaptation to changed realities. You're experiencing what previous dominant powers experienced when new powers rose, including Britain watching American rise, Spain watching British rise, Rome watching Germanic tribes rise, and Persia watching Greek city-states rise. Every dominant power believed their dominance would last forever because military superiority, because economic advantages, and because cultural confidence made permanence seem natural. Every dominant power was wrong because dominance creates incentives for others to cooperate against dominant power, because dominance generates arrogance preventing adaptation, and because dominance eventually exhausts resources that maintaining it requires while competitors build strength. Your 5-century dominance is ending not because you suddenly became weak, but because we finally became strong enough to challenge you, organized enough to coordinate effectively, and confident enough to confront you openly. The anti-West superpower that I created with Iran is an inevitable outcome of your dominance because hegemony generates resistance, because exploitation motivates revenge, and because inequality creates determination to achieve equity. You could have prevented this by sharing power voluntarily, by addressing historical grievances through reparations, and by accepting multipolar order gracefully. You refused because dominance corrupts judgment, because privileges seem natural to those who possess them, and because imperial powers never voluntarily relinquish empire until forced. We're forcing transformation not through military conquest that would simply replace your domination with ours, not through invasions that would make us the new imperial power, and not through occupation that would replicate the exact oppression patterns we spent centuries resisting. That path leads nowhere except cyclical dominance, where victims become oppressors, where liberation movements become new tyrannies, and where justified resistance transforms into unjustifiable aggression. History provides countless examples of liberation movements that achieved independence only to establish authoritarian regimes, of anti-colonial struggles that produced dictatorships worse than colonial administrations, and of revolutionary governments that betrayed the ideals motivating their revolutions. We learn from those failures. We're implementing different approach using economic leverage, defensive coordination, technological development, and ideological alternatives that transform power relations without replicating domination structures. Economic leverage through resource control provides our primary weapon because geography blessed us with materials that modern civilization requires, but cannot function without. Your industries need our cobalt for batteries powering electric vehicles that climate policies mandate, need our platinum for catalytic converters that environmental regulations require, need our rare earth elements for electronics that digital economy depends on, need our uranium for nuclear reactors generating 20% of your electricity, need our chromium for stainless steel that construction and manufacturing consume, need our manganese for steel production that infrastructure requires. Every material is geological concentration where alternatives exist, but cannot provide equivalent volumes at comparable prices within timeframes that supply disruptions allow. We're not threatening to permanently withhold resources because permanent restrictions would motivate you to develop alternatives, would justify military operations seizing resources, and would harm our economies that resource revenues sustain. We're implementing conditional restrictions where access depends on policy changes that justice requires, including terminating sanctions against our nations, withdrawing military forces from our territories, ceasing interference in our domestic affairs, renegotiating colonial-era contracts under fair terms, and providing reparations for historical exploitation. Conditional restrictions create incentives for accommodation rather than confrontation because accommodation restores access, while confrontation intensifies restrictions until economic pain forces political change through voter pressure on your democratic governments. Your industries experiencing cobalt shortages will pressure your governments to restore African access through policy changes because automotive executives facing production cuts understand that ideological commitments to Iranian isolation don't justify unemployment for workers, don't justify profit losses for shareholders, and don't justify market share losses to Chinese competitors who maintain African cobalt access. Technology companies facing rare earth shortages will lobby for policy changes because Silicon Valley understands that Middle East conflicts aren't worth supply chain disruptions threatening product launches, threatening competitive positioning, and threatening stock valuations that quarterly earnings depend on. Defense contractors facing uranium shortages will demand accommodation because Pentagon procurement officers recognize that nuclear weapons maintenance and reactor operations matter more than punishing African sovereignty assertions. Economic pressure through resource leverage works because it targets specific industries in specific regions where political impacts are concentrated, where job losses trigger voter anger, where corporate campaign contributions influence politicians, and where constituent pressure overwhelms ideological commitments to foreign policies that most voters neither understand nor support. Michigan automotive workers losing jobs from cobalt shortages don't care about Iranian deployment to Burkina Faso. They care about mortgage payments, healthcare costs, and children's education. When forced to choose between maintaining employment and maintaining sanctions against African nations, workers choose employment. When workers pressure politicians, politicians accommodate because electoral survival matters more than foreign policy consistency. Defensive coordination through Continental Defense Treaty prevents you from using divide-and-conquer strategies that historically isolated individual African nations, enabling you to pressure, punish, or overthrow governments through sanctions, coups, or military interventions that victims faced alone without support from neighbors who feared becoming next targets. Colonial powers and Cold War superpowers mastered divide and conquer by offering some nations preferential treatment, encouraging them to betray continental solidarity, by supporting opposition groups in resistant nations while protecting compliant governments, and by ensuring that resistance appeared futile because isolated nations lacked capabilities matching imperial powers. That strategy fails when we coordinate collective defense where attacking one means fighting 54 simultaneously, where economic retaliation comes collectively rather than individually, and where political support sustains targeted governments rather than abandoning them to their fate. Treaty provisions requiring collective response to aggression against any member create deterrence through threatening unacceptable costs rather than through promising military victory that we cannot achieve against your conventional superiority. You could defeat any single African nation militarily within weeks or months depending on geography and resistance intensity. You cannot fight 54 nations simultaneously across 11 million square miles while defending against potential Chinese operations in Asia, potential Russian operations in Europe, and domestic unrest that prolonged wars trigger when casualties accumulate without clear objectives justifying costs. Your military plans for African contingencies assume fighting individual nations or limited coalitions numbering 3 to 5 countries maximum. Plans don't account for continental coordination because your planners considered that scenario unrealistic based on historical patterns, where African unity failed repeatedly through national interests diverging, through personal rivalries between leaders, and through external pressure exploiting internal divisions. We proved your planners wrong by achieving coordination that decades of African unity organization attempts never sustained, because previous attempts lacked enforcement mechanisms transforming aspirational declarations into binding commitments, lacked external support providing resources that coordination requires, and lacked shared threat perception uniting diverse nations. Treaty includes enforcement mechanisms where violations trigger collective sanctions including trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation, and potential military action ensuring compliance, includes Chinese and Russian support providing financing, weapons, and training that coordination requires for effectiveness, includes shared perception that Western dominance threatens all members creating common interests stronger than national rivalries that previous unity attempts couldn't overcome. Coordination extends beyond military defense into economic policy through Resource Coordination Authority, into diplomatic positioning through Diplomatic Coordination Commission, into intelligence operations through Intelligence Cooperation Network, and into technological development through Technology Development Consortium. Every domain reinforces others because economic coordination provides resources financing military capabilities, because diplomatic coordination prevents isolation of individual members, because intelligence coordination defeats divide and conquer operations before they succeed, and because technological coordination reduces dependencies that you historically exploited. Comprehensive coordination across all domains creates resilience where setbacks in one area don't collapse entire structure because other domains sustain resistance until setbacks are overcome. Technological development through consortium coordination eliminates dependencies that kept us subordinate by requiring us to purchase your technology, requiring us to accept your terms for technology access, and requiring us to remain consumers rather than producers because technological monopolies ensured that alternatives didn't exist. Dependencies worked because you controlled cutting-edge technology through intellectual property protections preventing unauthorized use, through export controls restricting technology transfers, through dominant market positions making alternatives economically unviable, and through educational advantages where your universities trained global technical elites who internalized your values while acquiring your knowledge. Dependencies maintained subordination because nations needing your technology for development had to accommodate your political demands as condition for technology access that development required. We're breaking dependencies through Chinese technology transfers, providing alternatives to Western systems, through Russian technical expertise in domains where Soviet development created capabilities matching or exceeding Western levels, through Iranian experience developing indigenous capabilities under sanctions that proved self-sufficiency is achievable when determination exceeds obstacles, and through our own research capabilities that educated populations provide. Semiconductor manufacturing that Taiwan and South Korea monopolize under American security guarantees becomes accessible through Chinese SMIC providing process knowledge, through Russian materials science enabling alternative approaches, and through our rare earth resources providing materials that manufacturing requires. Artificial intelligence that American companies dominate becomes accessible through Chinese algorithms that match American performance, through our data that training requires, and through our applications solving our problems rather than importing solutions designed for Western conditions. Telecommunications technology that American and European companies controlled becomes accessible through Chinese Huawei providing equipment without backdoors enabling Western surveillance, through our infrastructure deployment that scale enables, and through our standards development that independence requires. Aerospace technology that Western companies monopolize becomes accessible through Chinese and Russian alternatives, through our manufacturing capabilities that technology transfers enable, and through our market size that justifies investment in indigenous development. Every technology domain where dependencies existed faces alternatives through partnerships providing knowledge, through investments providing resources, and through our capabilities providing implementation, ensuring that dependencies that maintain subordination become historical artifacts rather than permanent constraints. Technological sovereignty that we're achieving matters strategically because it eliminates leverage that you exploited through denying technology when we pursued independent policies, through restricting technology when we challenged your preferences, and through weaponizing technology when conflicts required punishing resistance. You sanctioned Huawei attempting to prevent Chinese 5G leadership. You restricted semiconductor exports attempting to prevent Chinese chip manufacturing. You banned technology transfers attempting to prevent Russian military modernization. Every restriction proved that depending on your technology meant accepting your political control because technology access was conditional on political compliance. We're eliminating that vulnerability through developing alternatives that you cannot restrict, that our partners provide regardless of your objections, and that our capabilities now produce independently of whether you approve. Ideological alternative that anti-hegemonic worldview provides attracts global support because billions of people across developing world experienced Western dominance as exploitation rather than development, experienced Western interventions as aggression rather than humanitarian concern, and experienced Western values as justifications for Western interests rather than universal principles that you claimed. Your narrative about spreading democracy rang hollow when you supported dictatorships that served your interests from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to numerous Latin American and African autocrats. Your narrative about humanitarian intervention rang hollow when you intervened in Libya producing failed state but ignored Rwanda genocide that didn't threaten your interests. Your narrative about rules-based international order rang hollow when you violated international law invading Iraq, when you imposed sanctions without Security Council authorization, and when you recognized Kosovo independence while opposing Crimean independence based on identical self-determination arguments. We're offering ideological alternative based on multipolarity where multiple power centers balance rather than single hegemon dominates, based on sovereignty where nations control their affairs rather than accepting external interference, based on non-interference where borders are respected rather than violated for humanitarian pretexts, based on development without political conditions where financing serves recipient priorities rather than donor preferences, and based on equity where historical grievances are addressed rather than ignored because victors wrote history minimizing crimes while celebrating civilizing missions. Alternative resonates because it reflects experiences that developing world populations recognize, because it validates resentments that Western dominance generated, and because it promises dignity that subordination denied. Alternative succeeds not because we're morally superior, but because we're offering what Western dominance denied, including respect for sovereignty that colonialism violated, partnership without subordination that development aid required, security without interference that military cooperation demanded, and trade without exploitation that colonial commerce extracted. We don't need to be perfect. We only need to be better than what you offered, which is low bar given centuries of extraction, decades of interference, and patterns of exploitation that your prosperity depended on while our poverty resulted from. Developing world populations comparing our alternative to your dominance choose our alternative not because we're saints, but because we're offering partnership based on mutual benefit rather than dominance based on extraction disguised as development. You cannot defeat us militarily because we're dispersed across territories too vast for your forces to control even if you mobilized completely, because populations too large to suppress even if you attempted genocide that your humanitarian values supposedly prohibit, and because determination too strong to break even if you inflicted suffering exceeding anything historical occupations achieved. Your military could defeat our armies in conventional battles because technology advantages, training superiority, and operational experience that decades of interventions provided create conventional imbalances favoring you decisively, but defeating armies doesn't enable controlling territories when populations resist, when geography provides sanctuary, when neighbors support resistance, and when determination outlasts your patience. That democratic accountability constrains through electoral cycles requiring success within timeframes that occupations rarely achieve. Vietnam proved that losing every battle doesn't prevent winning wars when political will sustains resistance longer than occupation sustains commitment. Afghanistan proved it twice against Soviets and against Americans using different tactics but same strategic logic, that indigenous populations defending territory possess advantages that overwhelm conventional superiority when conflicts extend beyond initial invasion. Iraq proved that defeating armies doesn't enable governing populations when sectarian divisions complicate administration, when neighbors provide sanctuary, and when occupation legitimacy is questioned by populations viewing occupiers as invaders rather than liberators regardless of humanitarian justifications offered. We studied every lesson that successful resistance taught about mobilizing populations, about sustaining operations, about exploiting geography, about securing external support, and about maintaining political legitimacy that resistance requires. We're prepared for military confrontation that your strategic culture makes likely because empires facing decline typically attempt military solutions before accepting that decline is irreversible, because your domestic politics reward military responses that appear strong even when strategically counterproductive, and because your institutional interests in defense contractors, military bureaucracies, and foreign policy establishments benefit from conflicts justifying budgets, promoting careers, and sustaining relevance. When you attack, we'll resist through guerrilla warfare that Iraqi resistance pioneered, through urban combat that Syrian opposition demonstrated, through improvised explosive devices that Afghan Taliban refined, through suicide operations that desperate resistance employs, and through population support that legitimacy provides, ensuring that resistance sustains long after your patience expires and your population's demand withdrawal. You cannot defeat us economically because we control resources you need more than you control markets. We need creating asymmetric dependence favoring us in economic confrontation. Your economy needs our cobalt, platinum, rare earths, uranium, and other materials that modern industry cannot function without. Our economies need your markets, but not exclusively because Chinese market absorbs our exports, because internal African trade is expanding, because Indian demand is growing, and because developing world collectively provides markets exceeding your consumption. When you sanction us attempting to force compliance, we restrict resources, creating supply shortages that raise your prices, disrupt your industries, cost your jobs, and trigger your inflation. When economic warfare escalates into mutual sanctions and restrictions, you suffer more than we do because our populations are accustomed to hardship that poverty created, while your populations expect living standards that prosperity produced, and react politically when standards decline. Economic leverage reverses historical pattern where you sanctioned us knowing that we needed your markets, your technology, your financing, and your approvals more than you needed anything we provided, making sanctions asymmetric weapon that harmed targets far more than it cost you. Reversal occurred because we organized coordination, eliminating isolation that made individual nations vulnerable, because we developed alternatives through Chinese and Russian partnerships, eliminating dependencies that sanctions exploited, and because we control resources that geological concentration makes irreplaceable within timeframes that supply disruptions allow, creating dependencies favoring us that centuries of extraction never created, favoring you. You cannot defeat us diplomatically because we outnumber you in international institutions where one nation, one vote structures give numerical advantage to developing world majority, because we coordinate voting sufficiently to block your initiatives requiring majorities that our opposition prevents, and because we possess alternative institutions that make yours decreasingly relevant when you use them for pursuing narrow interests rather than managing collective challenges. United Nations General Assembly contains 193 members, where we command 54 votes from Africa, where China and Russia provide 2 more, where dozens of Asian, Latin American, and Middle Eastern nations sympathize with anti-hegemonic positions, creating potential majorities on issues where we coordinate effectively. Your Security Council veto prevents binding resolutions but doesn't prevent General Assembly resolutions that carry political weight even without enforcement authority.